Hello. I'm Jenna, and this is Smarter News, quick, concise, nonpartisan information with a twist today. We're doing something special. It's like going through your entire week only drinking black coffee with non-dairy, non-sugar creamer. But then you hit later in the week and you relax a little bit. That's what we're doing today. We're going to go over some of the big news items of the week. But more importantly, what we're going to do is actually answer some of your questions. Any sort of questions you have on the news, I want to make sure that we provide some answers and context. Because really, what is Smarter News all about? Smarter News is about building a solution in news. When I was working in quote unquote traditional media, one of the big questions I always got was, where do you go to get the news? Which I thought was sort of shocking. You know, it's like asking a fisherman, where do you go to get the fish? You're like, what do you mean? What do you mean? But it's because it's been very difficult just to access what's going on and why it matters. And that's why I built Smarter News. And that's why we are building a solution in news. So what we're going to do today tackles a few different things. And before we get to some of your questions, here's what I've been hearing from you and what I'm trying to attempt to do today. We really focus on high quality information in small bites. And when I started Smarter News almost 4 years ago, I thought if I have 30 seconds to 3 minutes with any given person and we can provide value, then that's going to be good for them and it's going to be helpful to staying more current. And if you get really high quality information in small doses over the course of a week, for example, then you start accumulating this knowledge and staying current doesn't feel as difficult. And that's how we started our Instagram lives and coffee talk in the morning, where we just go over 3 news items a day. So that number 3 has been really important to me all the way back into the beginning. 30 seconds to 3 minutes, 30 minutes maybe for an interview. 3 things, 3 top stories for a day. This is, I feel like if it's good enough for the Holy Trinity, it's good enough for us when it comes to 3 stories on any given day. But there's a lot of content that we do outside of those 3 stories that I want to figure out a way to get to you. And you often have questions. Well, what about this? What about this? Why aren't we covering this? What about more, because you're interested and you're curious about the world, and we want to be there for you for these things. And we can do that in a few ways. One way we can do that is by expanding the team. I want Smarter News to be able to serve you high quality information in all sorts of ways. And that means doing it beyond myself. So I want the medical team at Smarter News to answer your questions. I want the money team at Smarter News to answer your questions. We want to grow and we want to change and we want to evolve. And that's going to take a couple things. That's going to take a couple steps. And we're moving in that direction. But until then, I thought, one of the things I love to do with the team, with my team, with any team that I've worked with, is I'd like to bounce some story ideas around. These were our editorial meetings, or maybe even after a show, you sit around and you think, okay, this is what we learned during the show today, or here's some of the topics we'd like to cover, but we're not quite sure how yet. And that's sort of the process that I'm going through on a regular basis during the week. I'll read, let's say 100 articles, and I'll say, well, out of all of those stories, I'm going to skim off the top 3 that I think. It's like taking that good part of the cappuccino. That's the part that I'm going to really talk about. The rest of these stories I'm going to continue to watch, but maybe they're not ready for prime time. But I want to figure out a way to answer your questions on those stories. And I want to figure out a way to talk to you about these stories. And so that's what we're going to do today. We're going to talk about some of the stories that I wasn't able to fully flesh out during the week. And we're going to take some of your questions on these stories and bounce some ideas around and see how this works for you. I was kind of thinking this is sort of like a weekly read-in where you're like, these are all the things that I've read. This is what I think is really interesting that I think you would find interesting too. And then what do you think about this? And how can we do this better for you at Smarter News? So that's how we're going to start off today. And one of the things that we're also going to do, and I haven't tried this, let me just take a moment here to talk a little bit about Instagram. Instagram has been so important to us. And it's important to us because it's important to you, because delivering news on Instagram for you has been convenient. And I want the news to be seamless. I don't want you to have to work hard for the news. It should just be there when you want it. It should just be really easy. But one of the reasons I stopped doing Instagram lives on a regular basis is I was having all sorts of trouble with the lives. We would do a live and then we would go to post it and it could take 3 hours to post, or it would come up black, like a black screen. It was just very bizarre. Some bizarre things were happening. Then some of you have told me you had trouble accessing some of our content as well. And listen, I don't know the reason why for any of that. I know it's easy to get into those dark places of like, why is it happening? Is there something sinister going on? I have no idea. I just want to focus on delivering the news. And so I think this is a great way to use the Instagram Live. Maybe we can figure out a way to use it and it can be productive again. But one of the reasons I step back doing it every day is it was taking me a long time just to get a video up. And sometimes I can also talk a lot during the Instagram Lives. And I like to keep things short for you. I can't help it. I get excited. My husband and I, we were actually having a fight this week a little bit, if I can be completely honest, because sometimes I get worried. I get worried. Entrepreneurship is really hard. Like, what are the next steps? How am I going to do this? What's going on? And he was like, you just got to focus on what's fun. Like, what's fun? And you know what's fun for me? Talking to you. That's actually fun. I love the news and I like talking to you. I was really basic. The rest of this stuff too, I could hire a team to help us with. But this, like, I can't replicate this. And so I was just like, I'm going to try it again. Let's just try it again. One of the things we're also trying today is badges. Have you guys seen this on Instagram? So this is sort of like having a tip jar, out if you liked your service, getting a cup of coffee, give them a tip. And I've struggled with any sort of subscription or monetization models for Smarter News because I want to keep everything really free, very easy. I'm not, when you're online and you want to read an article and it's like this thing bounces up in front of you, you can't even access the information. I don't want to do that. And I think if we're really trying to create a solution in news, then we're not going to replicate the things that we don't like that are out there. So I'm trying to think about some creative ways and we'll see we'll see how this works today and just give it a try. I never want to get so far down the road with entrepreneurship, and our audience has really grown, right? And it can be nerve-wracking to talk in front of a bigger audience sometimes. It's true. I never want to get so nervous or so discouraged that I'm not willing to try new things. And so that's what we're going to do today. We're actually going to try new things and we're going to see how this works. And I'm really, really interested in your feedback because the only reason I'm doing this is for you. Like I can talk to myself a lot. I actually do talk to myself a lot, but this is way more fun. So what I'm going to do is just start with what the president talked about yesterday. I was able to give you guys a couple highlights and we had a very short video. I took basically a 2-hour news conference and sat with it last night, watched it over again, which is a lot to do. It's a lot of content. And really think about what are the big points. So we have a 4-minute video of what the president said, but he said a lot more than that. But one of the great things of like sitting there with the information is that you get to listen to it over and over again. And there were a couple of things that I thought were important. And I think these are important to flag because I think they could be important down the line for you. So the president, I also have to say this, one of the big takeaways from this, and I'm curious what you guys think about this, was the length of the news conference. And I can almost feel his communications team like just taking like deep breath, because what the president did is he took many questions. He had an opening statement that lasted about 12, 13 minutes. Then he took a bunch of questions. It went about an hour. And then he sort of had this statement about the historic times that we're in. And it was a very thoughtful, kind of reflective, natural place to pause. And he almost was like, you just thought he was going to leave. And then he didn't. And he went almost another hour. And here's the thing. Shorter is always better. You get yourself into trouble by talking more. This is something I know from live television and from life, and I'm going to try to remember it here today. That's the reality. But it also enabled us to see him tackle a lot of different questions from so many different journalists and news outlets. And that is something that you don't often get to see. So a couple takeaways from this that I thought were really important for you. In the first minute that the president talked, he was right away listing his accomplishments, his perceived accomplishments for last year. And the first thing that he mentions, which we know is always the most important, is vaccinations. The reason why I think this is important, because it's right up there with accomplishments with job creation. The White House is talking about 6 million jobs created last year. When we talk about job creation, that can get a little tricky. Some of these jobs are coming back that were lost during the pandemic, but it's considered job creation. And that number is very high. It's historic. But the vaccination program is right up there. The reason why I think this is important is that we talk a lot about vaccines as part of health, about your health. But in this way, it's actually being it's being talked about and used in a political sense. This is a political achievement for the president. And the reason why that's important is because there's a lot of questions moving forward about vaccination programs and what those look like, not only in the United States and all over the world. The reason why I think this is also important is the CDC director just this week came out and said, I wish I was more clear, and I'm paraphrasing here, about the uncertainty of what we're dealing with. And so I think those are two sort of interesting messages coming from the federal government, because the future of this vaccination program and what these vaccines look like as this pandemic continues is an ongoing question. We didn't think necessarily at this time last year that we'd be talking about a booster shot, or in some cases, a second booster shot, or in some cases, a completely different vaccine. So I think it's really important that the White House is considering that one of its number one political accomplishments, because it is the White House and this is politics. Second thing I want to talk to you about is how the president described Russia. And he described Russia in a very thoughtful way. He said, kind of described Russia as being this lost nation between China and the West. And in some ways, that was almost sort of like a romantic, sympathetic way. But it also, when you really think of the map of Russia, hits home about where Russia is in the world and how it can feel lost and isolated. The president made a comment that's getting a lot of attention because he sort of said, again, paraphrasing here, when asked, well, what is the United States prepared to do if Russia invades Ukraine? He sort of said, well, it depends. It depends on what they do, right? It depends on what sort of invasion it is. And to some, there was a concern that could be interpreted as like a green light to just do a little invasion, not a full invasion. Any parent knows, right? It's like you tell your kid they have to stay quiet. We're going to play the quiet game. You can't say anything. And then they start talking, they do. And you're like, wait, that's crossing the line, and foreign policy, by the way, great, interesting foreign policy parallels with parenting and what it takes to actually put boundaries down. So that'll be interesting to watch any kind of further debate that you might see about that comment and whether or not, it did provide a little opening for Russia to misbehave just a little bit. But we don't know. We don't know what President Vladimir Putin's plans are. Third thing, no talk about the border. No talk about the border at all. There was a passing reference. This is really important because at the U.S. southern border last year, we saw a record number of encounters that is bigger than anything in modern records, but we believe ever at the U.S. southern border. Why do I think this is important? Because what was the fuel to the fire for President Trump's campaign in 2016? What coalesced conservatives more than any other issue at that time? The border. The border is very sneaky in journalism because it comes up every once in a while, and if it doesn't get a lot of oxygen, it won't get a lot of coverage. But push comes to shove in an election year, it becomes really important. It becomes one of those visceral issues for voters. By the way, voters that are liberal and conservative. And so the fact that it wasn't mentioned, it wasn't chosen by journalists, I thought was interesting. The fact that, I wouldn't expect the White House to mention it because it wasn't good news for the White House, but it's definitely a story to watch because of the historic numbers. And then finally here, the president got a question from Fox News, and it was a question that, and I'm sort of laughing because, listen, I worked for Fox News at one time, but it was such like a stereotypical question from Fox News of like, why are you pulling the country so far left? It's like you can anticipate that question. And so the president sort of had an interesting answer, but that also told us a lot. He described, and he said, I'm not Senator Sanders. I'm not Bernie Sanders. I'm not a socialist. I'm a mainstream Democrat. This is important. One of the big issues for the Democrat Party, especially in a midterm year, and by the way, equally a big issue for the Republican Party, is how they define themselves. And with the Democrats, we've really seen tension between those in the party that are more progressive. Sometimes this group is called the Squad in the House of Representatives. You have Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, for example, as part of that. You have Senator Bernie Sanders in the Senate. And they are further left than other Democrats. And sometimes the Democrat Party kind of doesn't know whether to fully embrace them and make them part of their main platform or push them away. But their popularity is such in certain circles that this is something the Democratic Party doesn't really know how to do. Same thing is kind of going on in a similar fashion from Republicans and conservatives about who's really a conservative and who's really a Republican, and who's really aligned with former President Trump and who's not. And so this sort of dance is interesting. So for the president to come out and say, I'm not a socialist, I'm a mainstream Democrat, which actually could be a pejorative by some Democrats that don't think mainstream Democrats have the right platform, is an interesting way to describe himself. So those are a couple of things I thought were interesting yesterday. The other thing that I thought was really interesting, and we'll kind of move into a different story here, is that the president was very adamant that schools have to stay open. Very adamant about that. That puts him at odds a little bit with a strong source of Democrat support, which are teachers unions. So the president, there's no daylight. The schools need to stay open. Did you know in New Mexico, the governor there has actually appealed to the National Guard in the state, to, if they are qualified, to substitute teach because they've seen some school closures or remote learning. And that just gives you sense. By the way, if you see a headline like I did, the National Guard comes into the school, you're like, are there troops in the school? No, it's not that. But trying to use resources in a creative way for schools to stay open. This is important for parents everywhere to know that's the position of the federal government. It may not be the position of your state government where you are, but it's also important because we saw in Virginia, in that really important governor's race there. And, I don't live in Virginia, so if you don't live in Virginia, this may not be as familiar for you, but it was a real bellwether race that people were watching late last year to tell us where voters are. And because this new Republican politician that no one had really heard of before won in a state that had voted for President Biden and had gone Democrat recently, was a big deal. And the number one issue that many pointed to for families and voters in that state was that the schools had stayed closed way too long. And so one wonders how much this issue is kind of being pulled into the midterms. I'm curious what you guys think about any of this, and happy to take any of your questions about what the president had to say yesterday and what you guys think about what we're hearing so far from the White House. Let's see. There are a lot of concerns about what's going on with the border and also how that intersects with what's happening with some of our healthcare policies as well. The border, it's interesting. I could pull it up right here. I'm happy to do that. Once a month, we always get a report card about what happened at the U.S. southern border. We should be around that time. It might have already come out. I should have checked before we jumped on. And that'll give us a further idea of whether or not this pace is continuing at the U.S. southern border. I think that's really important to understand. Part of the reason for what we're seeing at the border, part of it, now there's all sorts of political debate about one of the reasons, but part of it was not simply because there was this policy for the first time in a long time that if you crossed the border, that you would be instantly sent back. I'm very, very much simplifying this. And so one of the things that Border Patrol has said is that has led to repeat crossings. So someone that comes over that's not successful, that ended up is confronted by law enforcement and turned right back around and sent back, may in a couple weeks or a couple months try again. Each encounter is one encounter. Each encounter is not one person. And so, the way that sometimes that's talked about is the White House will say, well, they're going to talk about that as part of the numbers. Either way, the pace of people at the border is high. So regardless about how we're looking at it. Okay, a couple other stories I wanted to mention to you today as well that are updates and some stories that we covered earlier in the week. Let's talk a little bit about Texas, a border state, and what happened at that synagogue almost a week ago, where you had a hostage-taking situation. A British man came over right before New Year's, and we don't really know what he did. We don't even really know all the steps that he took to come to Texas. As I mentioned, there seems to be some sort of connection or reference to a woman who is in prison in Texas because of attempting to kill and assault U.S. soldiers in Afghanistan as part of a terrorism investigation. Now, right after this man was killed, we learned that in the UK, the British police arrested what we now believe are his sons. but there's some news overnight that they arrested 2 more people. And in addition to that, there are reports, and it's not on the record yet, but citing British and US investigators, that he was a known entity, that he was part of an inquiry or investigation in 2020, but that somehow it was closed. This is a commonality in so many of these cases that are somehow terror related. It's also a commonality that we see in other crimes as well, where you see, quite frankly, an act like we saw with hostage taking. And it's that this person, the initial reports are, we had no idea. There'd be nothing. There's nothing to indicate that they would do anything crazy like that. And then you find out later that actually they were being watched by investigators. Or, for example, in an event like a school shooting, that in fact there were red flags that were raised by teachers, for example. There always are those patterns, and those are hard to see because you don't want anyone to get hurt. Luckily, in this hostage taking situation, the hostages were able to get out. But it's important for you to know that's a really key update to the story. I want to make sure. Anna is asking, how did he get into the U.S. if he was on a watch list and known to what is equivalent to an intelligence agency, our intelligence agency in England? That's a great question, because one of the big deals with terror watch lists, and this applies also, by the way, to American citizens. You can find yourself on a watch list. You don't even know how you got there, and there's no way for you to sometimes get off. And that's caused issues for people that don't believe they should be on there. What's interesting here is, was he part of an opening of an investigation that didn't go anywhere and then was closed? And if it was closed, then maybe he wouldn't be flagged at all. Is it like speeding? That you always have a ticket on your record, and should that ticket be seen by other countries like the United States? Are we speaking to our counterparts correctly? It's a great question, and one that we don't know at this exact moment, because there is an argument that someone could do something bad in their past and they recover. They speed in the past, and then their record gets wiped clean, and you don't know that. Obviously, terrorism is a different crime than speeding, but there is that question with that. Here's my question for this story that I think is also really important. Where did he get the money? What does he do? Like, how did he fund this trip? Where did he go? What you got to have some cash. It's not, you can't. It's an expensive ticket. You're flying during the holidays. We know that. International. Did he buy a one-way ticket? These are some of the questions. I think the money always tells us something as part of this story. So speaking of money, and this also is going to the East Coast, a lot of you have questions about what's going on with President Trump, former President Trump. And there's 2 different stories that have come out this week that I think are worth at least knowing about. One, I want to give you a little background that goes way beyond recent years. And the other one has to do with the investigation into January 6th that the Supreme Court just ruled on. That's actually pretty big news. So real quick, in New York, President Trump and his family is facing an investigation about whether or not they've been forthcoming or accurate with their financials. One thing you should know about this is that I worked way back in the day. I worked at a place called Forbes. You know Forbes, right? Forbes.com. Forbes is those lists, right? The 100 most rich people in the entire world, the wealthiest billionaire, all that fun, the most famous celebrities. And we would often do reports related to those lists. And President Trump, at the time, not a president, was always on the list. And there was always an asterisk next to his name because no one could actually figure out exactly how much he was worth. There was always a question because it wasn't public. He wasn't running these huge public enterprises where you have to give all your financials out. It was different. He was buying real estate. He was making investments. And anyone knows with real estate, there's all sorts of ways that you're using debt and you're using cash and you're all of this. And so I always think about that because even 20 years ago, there was a question about whether or not anyone had a real accurate understanding of how successful he really was, if they could really put a dollar amount to it. It was always a mystery. It was always, could we find out what it was? And so in some ways, you should know that this is a new iteration of a story that's been around for a long time. Of course, there are accusations there are a lot of politics involved here because there's a question about whether or not former President Trump will run for re-election. So yes, there's politics in this, and I don't want to dismiss that. But I also want you to know that this question has been around for a while. So going to what the Supreme Court did this week, President Trump was trying to he wasn't trying to withhold himself, like he had the records with him, but as a matter of being president, you have information that then is turned over or filed with the National Archive. And that's just the way that we keep records. The National Archive also is connected to presidential libraries. So if you go to a presidential library and you see all these kind of artifacts from a president's term, that's connected to the National Archive. And so some of the president's records are kept with the National Archive. And there was an attempt by the investigative committee, the select committee in Congress, that wanted to get some of the president's records from around that time frame of January 6th. And he said, no, you can't get my records. Like, that's executive privilege. These are private conversations. If, by the way, a president's not protected by executive privilege, then, we can't have frank conversations with our advisors, because a lot can be said just in a matter of advice. And we need to make sure that we can do that, and that's an argument from other presidents as well. Well, one court said, no, in this case, these documents should be handed over as part of the investigation, more than 700 documents. And the Supreme Court agreed with the lower courts. This is an important part in this investigation. Again, so many politics involved in this story. Sometimes I have a difficulty of understanding when exactly to step in for this, because this investigation is ongoing. It's time and money and effort. It's your time and money, because these are your lawmakers that are representing you. And we've seen, past investigations last years. And the question always is, like, what is actually going to be actionable that comes from it, that's going to be helpful, worthwhile, all those things. We don't really know that at this time. But the fact that the Supreme Court, with 3 justices that were appointed by President Trump, sided with the lower court and said, no, this isn't protected, I think is important, and kind of elevates the investigation a little bit, because now there's going to be actual documents from the White House. And we'll see. We don't know. They didn't, as of last night, no one had seen those documents. Some of the lawmakers are doing interviews. They hadn't seen them yet. So we don't even know what's actually in them. But an interesting development. So, all right, let me see. What else would you guys like to talk about today? I'm so curious about what sort of questions you might have. Anything about anything this week. Some of what I've discussed and some of which I haven't is totally fine. And I see, Katie, you mentioned something. Katie was bringing up that one of the reasons why, and we've talked a little bit about this week, but I think it's really important. It's one of those things that gets lost, and you're like, why didn't I know that? So what Katie was mentioning is that one of the reasons it's believed that this hostage taker came to Texas is because there's the woman in prison that I mentioned has been serving more than 80 years in prison for attacking U.S. soldiers, and the reason why she was being investigated was related to Al-Qaeda. The bigger picture here is that ISIS and Al-Qaeda in the past have demanded her release in their bartering with the U.S. government. So her name has come. It may not come up to us at all. We haven't heard her name said in the news at all. It's been mentioned by these terrorist groups. And so that's one of the reasons why we're wondering, is this guy at all connected to a broader organization? Let's see. Simple Elegance is asking, do you expect that the White House will respond? Is it to the Prime Minister? What the Prime Minister did yesterday? Is that what you guys are asking about? That would be a really interesting question. So if I'm reading it right, which I may not be, but this is still interesting. The Prime Minister over in England announced some really interesting changes to their COVID policies. And he said they did it because there's been strict adherence to the current rules and that the data is suggesting it. So he's not just doing it. Of course, he also got in a little trouble recently for apparently holding a party during a time that he shouldn't. So, but this is coming out, and this will probably be more popular to a lot of the public. So basically, the UK government came out and said, listen, we're going to pull back basically all of our COVID policies that are the most significant to an individual. So your vaccine pass that you might have to flash to get into somewhere, the government's not going to require it. Private businesses can if they want to. You're going into a pub and they may want that. By the way, wouldn't it be great to go into a pub today? We're going to have to figure out a good pub, like a good Smarter News pub. That would be great. I'm not a beer drinker, but a good pub, kind of cold day, January, sounds good. Okay. So if you had to flash your vaccine, a vaccine accreditation, your businesses could still do that, but the government's not going to ask. The government's not going to require you to wear a mask. They're going to suggest it if it's in really crowded areas that are really tight. They think that you probably should still do that, but they're going to leave it up to you. And they're not going to suggest that you work from home anymore. So, those are like, check. Those are the big things. Those are the big things. What's interesting is that then you have neighboring France that's saying, just earlier this week, like in order to get anywhere, you need a booster shot. And by the way, it's going to be in that QR code that you're carrying with your phone. We actually, one of our colleagues is in Paris for a year. And so I'm having her work on a little special project for us. She's working as part of a different job and she's still working for us. And it provides really great perspective because I went to her and I asked, well, there's all these exceptions about traveling. If you had a prior infection, if you could show a negative test, and if you're vaccinated, how you can get around Paris. And she was like, listen, at the end of the day, like you really need to show your vaccination. And if you don't get your booster shot within days of when you're supposed to get it, like it's a problem. It's a problem, but it's not just, England and France. You're seeing other countries. Austria is trying to get their vaccination rates up. They're trying to use a lottery, like an award system. So you're seeing a real division. I mean, you've seen it. We've obviously seen it. And I know we've all debated it probably in our own private lives. We have a lot of different opinions about health policy during this time. But man, you're really seeing kind of a dividing line of how different countries are handling this. And of course, I'm always looking for, well, what will the data show us in 90 days? It'll show us something. I can't, note to self, I'm going to make sure to have some more graphics ready for you. Maybe next week, if you guys like this. When I look at the map of the United States and it's so deep red, representing a high level of positivity for COVID infections. Doesn't mean serious cases, just means positive cases. And like the whole map right now is like a deep, scary red, And I have to admit, as someone that's covered this, listened to CDC briefings more than I'd care to tell you or should add up, that I would think at this time that we would see a real difference. And there's different ways governors will say like, oh, the percentage, if you look at this percentage, it's going to be different than this percentage and we're better off than they are. And everything's simple. There's always a simple answer to everything. And you would think that the map would show the big difference in policy because we have really different policies in place. But right now it doesn't. Maybe that's just Omicron. Maybe that's just this coronavirus. Maybe there's another lesson there. I don't know. Laura, thank you so much. Oil prices. Man, that's a great question. And you're bringing up something that I wasn't able to cover as part of the president's talk yesterday because he did mention inflation. And one of the interesting things he said was about oil prices, something else I wasn't expecting. He said he's working hard. One of the ways that people really feel the impact of inflation is filling up your gas tank. And he said that he had worked with other countries. And we talked about this deal in the past where countries got together and said, oh, we're going to make sure that we're going to put out more oil supply. More supply will hopefully bring down the price. But he said we need to make sure that we have a good supply of oil and natural gas, and that's not necessarily some of the more popular green energy proposals that you often hear from mostly Democrats. And so it was something that he talked about with inflation. He did address it. The reason why it was difficult for me to grab a soundbite is that he mentioned, the reason why we have inflation is supply issues, all related to the pandemic, and my Build Back Better plan, which is going to help stimulate and help support businesses and competition is really the key here. There's the other side of inflation, though, as well. The supply chain issue definitely is a part of inflation because if you have low supply, high demand, then prices go up and they kind of keep going up. And everybody tries to keep up. And that's one of the reasons you get that inflation effect. But inflation is also can be caused by too much stimulus. There's too much money in the economy. We've flooded too much in over the years, not just in recent years, but over the years. And when you have too much money supply out there, what happens when you have too much supply of anything? The value of it goes down. And so that can be a part of inflation as well. Too much stimulus. How to come back from that and how to use stimulus is one of the great debates among economists all over the world. So we don't have an answer to that. Let's see, anybody else? Oh, interesting questions about what's going on with different states and how they're dealing with issues with the economy, with homelessness, for example. Jamie's asking about the attitude of the military right now with all these foreign issues. I'll be very curious if anybody's a service member would like to jump in. We're quickly shifting our focus from Afghanistan to Russia and Ukraine. It's completely different battlefields. I mean, completely different. The president was very clear that he would be open if Russia felt threatened of pulling back different strategic missiles that we and others have placed in Europe or are proposed to place in Europe. But that he's not going to push back any of our strategic alliances or our forces or how we're approaching Europe, especially Western Europe. We have obviously a large military base in Germany. We have a presence in Europe. The question is, what are we willing to do militarily if there's an actual invasion? It's hard to say that out loud, isn't it? Because the thought of some sort of land war happening, and granted, it's important to note that Russia and Ukraine, they've been fighting a land war for 10 years. There's been a lot of people that have died on both sides. And that's why the president mentioned yesterday that Russia really has an equation to try to figure out here too, because you can lose. You can both garner support from your country, getting everyone coalesced around a common goal, but you can quickly lose support if it's believed that it's not worth losing lives over. And the reality is that could absolutely happen. And we really haven't seen anything like that in a few decades. And, the wars that we've been fighting have been so, quote unquote, untraditional, although I don't know if you can call them untraditional anymore because we've fought them for so long. This kind of terrorist guerrilla warfare, for lack of a better word. When we were fighting in Iraq, we weren't fighting Iraq's military, we're fighting Al-Qaeda. Right. Right. So it's a different type. When you're Afghanistan, we're working with the government there against a force. It wasn't that we were fighting Afghanistan. So and that was one of the difficult challenges of trying to figure out what the goals were there and what winning really looked like. And we've had to ask that. So let's see. Anything else, you guys? Some of you are asking some questions about policing, which would be a really interesting topic. I'd love to have you guys to have like some special guests for you on these lives, and maybe have people jump in on what you're seeing in your own area, and also maybe have some experts. It might be fun to have a foreign policy expert join us and take some of your questions. Some of you are asking about violence in our cities and policing. I know this is a really big issue, and we've seen a lot of high profile crimes in the last several weeks. And I'll leave you with this. I remember it was during the second election of President Obama. I was waiting off camera, between doing a couple things. I wasn't doing a lot of coverage that night. I had a couple special assignments, like everything else. Like you get ready and forget in front of the camera, and then something happens, and that happens all the time in news. So I was using that time to talk to some of the great strategists, political consultants that were just hanging out, waiting for their turn, doing the same thing. And one of them said to me, because I think going into it, there might have been a question about whether or not the race would be closer, but it wasn't. President Obama won handily, and that's what happened. And he said, at the end of the day, no matter what anyone tells you about politics, it's only about a couple things. It's, am I safe? Can I provide for my family? And what does the future look like for my kids? And that's it. He's like, even if they don't have kids, it's the thought about the future. And that question of, am I safe? And how one looks at that question can be whether, am I safe from an outside attack like terrorists or an outside force in another country, but also, am I safe in my own city? How that's translated into voting, whether it's for local politicians or for, federal offices, is another question entirely. What do you guys think is the number one issue here? This is also really important now that we're in this period that Congress still will work. I know that may be a question for some of you. Like, are they working? Yes, they're working. They're going to work for a couple more months, really focused in Washington, D.C. They may try to get a couple things passed. Can they pull off? Democrats will try to pull off parts of maybe this Build Back Better plan and try to get parts of it through. They'll try to do something. They're going to try to do something. But then they're all, every single member of the House of Representatives is up for election, and you got a handful of important senators are up for re-election as well. And then everything turns into midterm and more local politics. And so the president's address now may look different when we get closer to the midterm elections, because you say it's going to try to help people get reelected.